with our webinar here with all our children. And I want to start by thanking Julie Lytle, the Executive Director of Province 1, for hosting us and providing the technology platform that allows us to have this online conversation. As we get started, I want to ask each of you please to mute your phones if you've not already done so. There's a drop-down arrow next to the phone icon at the top of the bar on your screen. There's also a slider on your screen in note box number 7. There's a slider that you can control. Depending on the size of your font, you can move it up and down to see the timing of our agenda at the top, and then you can scroll down to see some references that our presenters this evening have recommended that we share with you. Our discussion is going to, after we do some introductions, our discussion will last about 30 minutes. And then we'll have 15 minutes of Q&A followed by a brief evaluation. And then our participants on the call will end the participant section of the call, but I'm going to ask our panelists to stay on for another 10 minutes or so after we wrap up the call so that we can do some learning and some debrief amongst ourselves. I'm Lally Lloyd. I'm director of the All Our Children National Network, and I'm going to be facilitating the conversation this evening between our panelists. All Our Children's mission is to build the movement for education justice by supporting congregations and their members who are exploring, forming, and leading community partnerships with public schools. We do this because we believe that the failure of U.S. public schools to educate all children to a high quality of education is not God's dream for God's beloved people, which is all people. And we are looking for ways of encouraging the church to be engaged and active in this work. To learn more about All Our Children's work and our vision and to join us, please go to our website at allourchildren.org. This evening is the 4th of our monthly webinars. Each month we invite experienced experts and practitioners to be with us to explore an important challenge or opportunity or question that we can all learn from. Our topic this evening is the trauma of poverty and public education and perspectives for volunteers, things that volunteers need to be aware of. Our panelists tonight are Hazel Carter, Dr. Hazel Carter, Associate Professor of Educational Leadership at City College of New York in the School of Education. Sophia Bryan Mizels, Social Worker at the Trinity Boston Foundation, serving the McCormick Middle School in Boston. And Don Coles, All Our Children Board Member, longtime school advocate and mentor and volunteer from Richmond, Virginia. We're pleased to have each of you with us this evening. Thank you all for being here, for being with us. This webinar is being recorded, and Mary Liz Murray, Director of Communications for All Our Children, is on the call with us, and she's going to be monitoring our chat board. So I'm going to ask her to explain to all of us a little bit how that's going to work. Mary Liz.
Thanks, Lally. Hello, everyone. We are very glad to have you with us. As you'll see to the right of the panel full of our video panelists, there is a notes section where you can see some reference material about the trauma of poverty and its intersection with public education. Please feel free to copy and paste any of those, to look through them, to ask questions, and to save them and share them with your volunteer groups from your congregations. Underneath that notes box, you'll see a chat box that says chat, and then in parentheses it says everyone. This is our place for open discussion while you are listening in. If you have questions, if you want to share your own experiences, please engage in this chat box. I will be moderating the chat so that as questions come up as you're listening, I'll be keeping a running list of those questions, and at the end of the conversation, I'll be asking our panelists to answer those questions. So as you listen and as you want to know more about something, please do share your questions in that chat box.
Thanks, Mary Liz. I'd like to open us with a word of prayer. And this prayer was brought to my attention by Bishop Stephen Charleston, who is a member of the Choctaw Nation. And so let us pray. Let me not look away, O God, from any truth I should see. Even if it is difficult, let me face the reality in which I live. I do not want to live inside a cosseted dream, imagining I am the one who is always right, or believing only what I want to hear. Help me to see the world through other eyes, to listen to voices distant and different, to educate myself to the feelings of those with whom I think I have nothing in common. Break the shell of my indifference. Draw me out of my prejudices and show me your wide variety. Oh, let me not look away. Amen. We've asked Hazel and Dawn and Sophia each to give us a brief introduction, organized loosely around two questions. What brought you to your work in public education? And where in your work do you connect or intersect with the trauma of poverty? Hazel, can we start with you, please?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I worked as a high school teacher in Brooklyn and in New York for about 10 years. And in 1993, I was hired as the executive director of a grant-funded program at LaGuardia Community College. And that program really looked at developing partnerships with public schools, colleges, and community-based organizations. And I think the most important thing is that I worked with folks who valued the importance of partnership building in improving schools. We developed several pipeline programs that worked to increase the number of at-risk students who would graduate from high school and move on to college well prepared. And these programs really supported my belief that each child should be prepared to enter college, whether they attend college or not. I think it's sort of our moral responsibility to have them well prepared to become productive citizens, and I know that not everyone will go. I'm fully aware, I went to parochial schools, and I'm fully aware that parochial schools and independent schools do a really wonderful job in graduating students from high school and entering college. In New York City, over 1 million students attend public schools, and many of them have experienced traumatic experiences, and really if it's left unattended, it could negatively impact wider society. It certainly would impact their life. And it is this need to affect large numbers of students whose life experiences will impact communities, which really drew me to public education. And I firmly believe that stronger students make stronger schools, and that leads to stronger communities. Would you like me to talk about how my work interacted with poverty? Yes? I work as a professor in education leadership, and so I work with teachers who aspire to be school administrators. And many of my students work in New York City public schools and in communities where there are certainly large numbers of students who experience trauma every day. In our courses, we talk a lot about how a school leader has to develop an instructional program that will serve students with multiple needs, including low-income, homeless students, bilingual students, and those with special needs. We talk about how you go about building supports in schools that will cater to the needs of those students, and how to provide adequate professional development for teachers and for all school staff. We talk about the difficulties of effectively working with families and the wider community in innovative ways. And we talk about the negative impact that mandated testing has on students. Also, my research is really grounded in working with at-risk students, their families, and their parents and teachers, and really the importance of building community through working with partnerships.
Thank you, Hazel. Thank you very much. Dawn, let's go to you, please. What brought you to your work in public education, and where in that work do you connect or intersect with the trauma of poverty? And work in this context is broadly defined.
Well, I'm a product of various public schools and private schools. I grew up in a military family, and we lived from Honolulu to Heidelberg, and we moved so frequently on occasion that I went to 5 different high schools. And one of the things that I experienced in moving and going to these schools was some were very receptive and open and inclusive, and others were rather hidebound in their traditions and their ways. So I've always been rather sensitive to how communities receive strangers into their mix, especially high schools. They don't, they develop their cliques, as you know, and as students do. When I moved to Richmond, Virginia, I joined St. Paul's Episcopal Church, and which was working very much in the area of healing the history of Richmond, which is devastated by a war and racism, and it was interested in healing. And one of the things it did was it started we had a series of hearings on what we should do to take our drive to reconciliation to some practical level. And after these series of hearings, we decided that working with a public school in the high poverty section of Richmond would be a healthy place for us to start. And but our motto, which was really important at the time, was that it was all about relationships. We were not going to fix anything. We were just going to be present and have relationships with the students and the parents and and the teachers. And our particular focus was mentoring. So it was that initiative that led me into public education, and of course I have my personal drive and interest in it. But to be perfectly honest with everybody, while I knew many different schools, many different cultures, I did not know poverty until I went to the schools of Richmond, Virginia. There was one, I was at an Episcopal church retreat somewhere, and I was speaking with someone who's now one of my icons, a fellow named John Coleman, who's an Episcopal priest who just worked in the neighborhoods. He didn't have a church. He worked on youth development programs. And I once said to John, I don't think I really don't understand poverty. And he said, oh, yes, you do. Get in touch with where you are the poorest and relate out of that. So that led me into realizing that there were trauma in my life. There were places where I was poor, and I could relate to people who had very different trauma, and I certainly had to learn different cultures and all, but it's been a tremendous learning for me. So as we go on, you'll hear that I've now been mentoring for over 15 years, coming out of this elementary school in East Richmond, and my mentee and I have now been together 10 years, and he's a junior in high school. We began it in 2nd grade. And with all due respect, Hazel, he's my professor.
The child is a
Thank you, Don. Yeah. Thank you, Dawn. And to you, Sophia, what brought you to your work in public education, and where does it connect or intersect with the trauma of poverty?
So I am the clinical manager of a therapeutic program that's embedded in a middle school in McCormick, and it's a trauma-based program. So we work 100% with young people who are dealing with toxic stress and complex trauma. And I think for me, first of all, school is where young people are. And so the idea of going to them in a context that we know will help them in many areas of the rest of their lives just feels natural. So going to meet kids in school and being a part of that community and working towards helping that space feel safe and welcoming to them versus sort of creating a therapeutic space outside of the school, I think just always felt logical to me. And then I think I was a kid with a fair amount of learning disabilities and got a lot of support around those learning disabilities, and it was told to me that it wasn't something bad, it was just something different that I brought into the school, and so I needed a different type of support to be able to be successful. And I was. And I think when I was at Hunter in New York for my master's program, and working in the schools there, I began to see a lot of adverse experiences that our young people were coming in with and trauma, and really felt like it didn't feel much different to me than a more typical learning disability. It felt like their whole selves needed a different kind of support to be able to learn, but they were brilliant and wise and curious young people, except for the fact that they were being criminalized for their behavior rather than being seen as needing a different kind of support. Because oftentimes their behavior led them to act in certain ways that the school felt like was a student acting out rather than a student not being given the support in the school they needed to be to succeed. And so at that point, I think I got mad. I got mad for the young people I served, and I think that was the beginning of my sort of commitment to doing work around trauma and education, particularly for middle and high school students. I think where it intersects for me is our school is 100% on school lunch, and there's a bunch of sort of demographics about the poverty that our kids struggle with. I would say that for the youth I serve, we cannot talk about poverty without talking about systemic racism and community violence. Those three things are wrapped in. But I'd say that the most important thing for me around the trauma and our young people is that I really don't think our young people would need the support we offer if they hadn't had to figure out how to survive and be strong enough to go through some of the traumatic experiences in their life. And that's really different than in mental health, how we talk about kids with trauma, which is something happened to you and now you have a mental illness. I think it's really important for us that we talk about the things that they are strong enough to have lived through, but also that sort of happen to them on no fault of their own. Poverty does not happen because you're lazy. Poverty does not happen because of these things. There are structures in our society that contribute to why some people are experiencing a lot of adverse childhood experiences and some kids are not. And so in our program, that's really important, both for us to remember as a staff, for us to sort of help to communicate to the school, but also for us to talk about with the young people.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to get the concept of ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, out in this conversation. And Sophia, could you say a little bit about what ACEs are and why it's important to people who want to understand the impact of trauma in general?
Sure. Hazel or Dawn, type in if you have more to add, please, because I'm no expert. But ACEs, it stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. It was a study done. It was a longitudinal study done, so it was a study that was done with adults in which they looked back and thought about the adverse childhood experiences that they'd gone through, and then the researchers sort of looked at challenges both in terms of mental health, in terms of physical health, and in terms of sort of challenging life experiences that people had in adulthood, and they found a very strong connection to having experienced adverse experiences in childhood and having to deal with a variety of physical health complications in adulthood. I feel like that's the easiest way for me to say it. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
Hazel, could you just give us some examples for people on the call who might not, for whom this term might be unfamiliar? Could you just give us some examples of the kinds of things that would be considered an adverse childhood experience?
I think I'm reminded of the words of demographer Harold Hodgkinson, who said that before a child's 5th birthday, during the most critical growth period for human beings, forces have been put in place that will encourage some children to shine, to do well, and will encourage a lot of other children to basically stun their growth and development. And some of those forces that work against students would be obviously poverty. For example, children raised by single mothers are twice as likely to live in poverty. Children who have a teen mother are almost likely to be raised in poverty. And by no means poverty is not the only factor that would affect the future of children. I think of, especially in places like New York, or basically all across the country, where you have large numbers of immigrant children, particularly those who are not native speakers of English. Many of those children, they perform adult roles. You know, they are translators for their parents. They are babysitters for their young siblings. They cannot stay after school to engage in any additional, tutoring or different types of activities because they have child rearing or babysitting to go to. And when you think of children of undocumented parents and what it is like to be in that situation, how traumatic that is. And when you think of the current climate, I just can't even imagine what they are going through every single day, and then they have to go to school and try and learn. So it's, in addition to poverty, you have all these other things going on, low household income, where parents have to work multiple jobs in order to survive. And very often they cannot come to an activity in school because they have to work. And the shameful thing is that in the United States, in terms of where we rank with other rich countries, let's say the top 41 countries in the world by income, we rank 33rd. Could you imagine that? We rank 33rd in terms of the high rates of child poverty. Children also go through, low-income children go through constant moving. So parents move because of jobs. They move because of homelessness. They move because they have to, the parents may have to work in one particular area, and then the child has to live with grandparents. And how traumatic that is when a child has to be pulled out of school in the middle of the semester because the parents have to leave. So there's so many different things to add to poverty. Quality of daycare, pre-K is very uneven, and children who experience good childcare in the first 5 years are more than likely to do well in school. So when you factor in all of those other things, it is not surprising that you have high rates of trauma in our children, in our young children.
Lally?
Thank you. Yes, Don.
Lally, I'd love to add, it was a great gift to me when I received training in ACEs, and as probably many of the listeners know, there's actually a form you fill out where you can check off the list. Did you grow up in a home with a divorced parent? Did you have a parent that was incarcerated? Was there a time when you didn't have enough to eat? were you abused physically or sexually? And you can, I don't remember, Sophie, how many there are on that list, but probably 20.
Yeah, there's generally
questions.
10. There's generally 10 in the general list, and the statistics say that anything more than 3 puts you at a much higher likelihood from everything from substance abuse to depression and anxiety to kidney disease. It really spans the gamut in part because we now know what stress does, you know, not just emotionally and mentally, but physiologically to your body.
So I'd like to use this moment to personalize this conversation. I know, Dawn, you, as you mentioned in your introduction, you've been working for 15 years with a mentee in the Richmond Public Schools. How have you seen, in your direct experience, how have you seen trauma affect your students' learning, your mentee's learning, and the educational outcomes that he's been able to achieve?
Right.
Or have you seen it, and if so, how?
Yes. Well, first of all, the school in which I'm going to use my mentee's first name, Todd Kwan. Todd Kwan went to an elementary school that is 100% free or reduced lunch. He lives in a federally subsidized housing project that has 300 units in it, and that housing project has 3 other housing projects of equal size within walking distance. So the concentration of poverty is extreme. He moved from elementary school to middle school, and it also is 100% free or reduced lunch, to a high school that's also 100% free or reduced lunch. So that's the environment in which he lived. What did I see? So he lives in a home with a single mother. His father comes and goes, but it's not a happy time when he comes. He experiences it as abusive, though not physically so. There's physical violence in the neighborhood. His mom has been shot in the foot by an errant bullet. My mentee's been shot at. His father's been incarcerated. His older brother's been incarcerated. He's been taught, I've discussed this with his mom, he's been taught to fight. Fight, flight, or freeze are the tools that he has, and fight is his preferred tool. And it gets stimulated at the very little provocation as he tries to protect his space. So he experiences that. He's had friends killed. He goes to schools that don't look particularly healthy. The hallways are crowded. Kids are jostling. The police community tries to do community policing, but my mentee does not know the names of the officers and is frightened of them. There's sicknesses in his family. Some relatives born with disabilities that are significantly impair their ability to walk and talk. There's illness, diabetes, and the resources in the home are quite limited. And it's a crowded place, believe it or not. People come and the mom has 3 kids. It's noisy, and there's always a crowd there. It is a very different environment, and I'm grateful I've been introduced to it. But and I'm grateful I know about ACEs. Harking back to John Coleman, when I take the test, I may score 2 out of 10. But when I do that for my mentee, it's 10 out of 10.
So thank you for that. I wanted to, I appreciate your sharing that with us, Don. I wanted us to be connected to real lives in our conversation this evening, so that we're not just talking in abstractions. Sophie, I think among all of us on the call tonight, you spend the most amount of time in a middle school. And I wonder if you can share with us about what the impact is on a school ecosystem, on a classroom, of having high proportions of children who are affected along the lines of the way that Dawn's mentee is.
Yeah, so I think one of the really important things, Dawn, that you talked about is that we rarely see, sometimes, but rarely do we see one traumatic adverse childhood experience, right? So if we start with, and I think we could start with many, but if we start with poverty, if I don't have a lot of money to choose where I live, that really affects where I live in a city. And if I live in a city and need to live in public housing or subsidized housing, then I'm generally living with a lot of other people who also are trying to get by on jobs that are not paying them enough to actually live their lives. And then there's an increase in crime because people are, that's the setup, right? So it layers on itself. An increase in crime means that those young people are sort of witnessing and seeing and potentially being a part of violence on a more regular basis. So they compound each other, and they're not sort of independently experienced, almost always with young people. And I think, again, I'm just going to keep naming this because I think we really need to. The systemic isms in our world are a huge part of this for our young people.
Right. Right.
So I think when we think about kids at school, there's sort of what I would call the tip of the iceberg issues with poverty and with different adverse childhood experiences, meaning if I only have enough food to eat one meal a day, it's hard to focus when I'm hungry, as I think most adults would be able to connect to. If, as is true for a lot of our kids, I really have trouble sleeping because a lot of really scary stuff has happened when I've fallen asleep, and therefore I only get 2 or 3 hours of sleep every night on a regular basis, it's really hard for me to focus for 7 hours in a classroom when someone's speaking at me, and I don't really get to get up. So that's what I sort of think of the tip of the iceberg. And then I think we go one level down, which is that part of what you also talked about, Dawn, was fight, or freeze. And we know that part of what happens with trauma and a number of adverse childhood experiences is that it actually changes the way that young people's brains develop. And so when kids are in this fight, flight, or freeze, we actually know that the part of their brain used in school, the part that does problem solving and executive functioning and holding multiple ideas at once to think about them together, stops working. So that's sort of a whole nother level. Like, is a kid's brain, subconsciously just their brain even in a place where they can learn at school, or are they just worried about figuring out how to survive? And the fight, or freeze is our survival mechanism. And then the third thing that I think we often don't talk about with trauma is that one of the big things that trauma does is make kids feel like they have no control over their lives. If I keep trying my best and still a lot of really tough and challenging and upsetting things happen to me, I eventually start to believe that I don't actually have control over the world, or I don't have agency over the world. And that, I think, for me is the scariest thing with our young people, because that leads to something that we call learned hopelessness, which means there's no real point in me having dreams because it's never going to work out anyways. And that, I think, is a part of trauma that we don't often talk about. I think that I've never met a young person who doesn't want to do well in their life, in school, in their future. But when so many hard things happen to you, no matter how hard you and your family and your community try to not make those hard things happen to you, you stop feeling like the effort is worth it because it just can get really disappointing. And so I think that's something that we don't talk about a lot in schools, and we need to, because that's a human connection. We just need to be compassionate and empathetic and human with each other. And also, I think it's where we see a lot of kids drop out of school. We have kids in middle school who, want to drop out because they don't really understand the point of that in their future. And I think that the more we can help young people realize their own worth, their self-worth, not just self-confidence, but really the worth that they have as human beings in the world, and the worth that they have to us as adults, how much we think they are worth, we're really doing something meaningful. And I don't think we always talk about that in schools.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Hazel, you work a lot around helping young people make a successful transition into higher education. How can communities in general and congregations in particular play a role in the kind of support that that Sophia is pointing at that young people need? How can those of us on this call who feel a desire to make the human connection that Sophia is talking about and that Don has been describing, how can we find a way to positively engage with this challenge?
I just want to, before I get into some of those things, I want to underscore the importance of looking at the high school dropout problem. And I think before we look at strategies, it's sort of important to really understand how glaring and how big that is a problem and the negative impact it has, not just on the individual, but on families and on society. So, you know, the more students drop out of school, things like crime rate increases, unwanted pregnancies, all of the negative type of behavior that we hear about is very much closely related to high school dropouts. And one of the other things I wanted to talk about is I came across this research on what students say that they needed, and I think the voice of the children, of the young people, are really, really important. You know, we think about planning all these different things, but sometimes we have to listen to what they say. They want more peer and mentoring programs. So, Don, what you're doing is exactly right on target. The students, they had surveyed a group of high school students across the country, and they talked about increased teacher training on the needs of minority students. They want programs that are developed for parents so that they could learn about the different situations that affect children's lives. One of the things that a congregation can do is not only to work with students, but to work with parents. We kind of assume that parents have got it together, but it is one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult job. And students or children who went through trauma, most of the time had parents who went through the same trauma, if not worse. So they also need as much help. And we need to create programs for students on diversity and stereotypes and really get the word out about this achievement gap and what an achievement gap does to not just the individual, but also to communities. And to constantly keep striving, pushing students to strive for higher success. In terms of what congregations can do, I think we need to look at how we define community, and very often community is really geared only towards parents. So when I define a community, I look at all the stakeholders that are necessary in a child's life to bring about success. So it's the religious-based institutions, higher education plays an important role, all the community-based organizations, museums, government agencies, funding sources, the school system. So we need to embrace this wider community and really remember that old African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. That is so important. So each and every member of the community has an important role. We need to focus on children earlier. We need to do more in preschool. That's not my background. I was trained as a secondary school teacher, and I'll tell you, very often when I was a teacher, I would want to know what happened to students when they went through elementary school. And elementary school teachers are probably asking the same questions. What happened to them in pre-K? So all of the trauma that a child goes through just does not, or it does not miraculously disappear when they enter high school or middle school. I say it goes with them in their little backpacks, and it goes to each level. So we need to kind of deal with the problem even before they enter elementary school. So a congregation could really focus on pre-K or work with pre-K organizations to really try to deal with the effects of trauma. Work with schools to really strengthen after-school and summer programs. More opportunities are needed to support what goes on during the school day. And very often schools, they have a lot of different programs going on after school, but I think one way to get a congregation involved is working with schools during the summer. And summer is, a lot of summer programs are usually for students who have not done well, but you know what, there's students who do well in school and they need enrichment. So we have to sort of change what after school and summer school is all about, and really continue doing things to support students during that time. Work with parents to develop literary skills. And one of the problems that students, when they hit middle school and high school, is they love to read in elementary school, but somehow literacy is not done much at all in middle school and high school, and we have to encourage that. I would love to see congregations get involved with schools and develop reading programs, not only for elementary schools, but for students in middle and high schools. Perhaps like an intergenerational book club. You have a retired person from the congregation who can work with middle school and high school students to really develop this love for reading. It is the core of everything that they do, and it's not encouraged because of the curriculum and testing, etc. It's not encouraged when they hit middle and high school. So there are tons of different things, there's tons of different options, and I think there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of work to be done, and I would urge congregations to, or put someone in the congregation to figure out what is your, what skills you have that you could work with schools. And schools, on the other hand, have to figure out ways to work with congregations. It's reciprocal. It's not just, the person going into the school and telling them what to do, but it's both. It's a relationship. And Don, you spoke about relationship building, and that's so important for building partnerships.
Yeah, I was going to turn to you, Don, because I know that your congregation, St. Paul's in Richmond, has had this relationship with the Woodville Elementary School now for, what, more than 15 years, I think, right? And I'm wondering what you've seen in terms of how it's grown and become and moved into arenas that touch on some of the things that Hazel was just listing, that I'm imagining were beyond the scope of what the congregation thought it was getting into when you got started all those years ago.
Yes. Well, we started, as probably many congregations did, with 5 volunteers at the school for a summer program. And as I mentioned, our primary focus was mentoring, which by definition is just have a one-on-one relationship, no mission, no goal for ourselves, but to be a friend, a caring adult for the student. But it grew over the years. In fact, it's sort of curious. We wanted to begin at 3rd grade because of literacy. We wanted the students supposed to learn to read by 3rd grade, and so that after 3rd grade they read to learn, as the formula goes. But the 3rd grade teachers weren't particularly interested in having volunteers or mentors. It was the 5th grade teachers. So we went with the 5th grade teachers. And when the 3rd grade teachers saw that the 5th grade teachers were making progress, they decided to come on board and ask for more mentors. So over the course of, that took a couple of years just to get that level of acceptance and trust that we weren't going to go away. We're not there for an event and leave. It was a genuine relationship. Well, it grew to about 50 mentors in the school, and then other churches saw it, and they began to come to the same school. Then the superintendent saw that it was making an impact and asked if other schools would be interested in such partnerships. And it grew greatly. But I think important is sort of what do we do there? So some it's mentoring, which can mean just 1 hour a week, but you show up at the same time, every week. If you're going to be away, you tell the student, I'm going to be away that week. And when you come back the week after you've been away, they go, I didn't think you were going to come back. You show up, and it makes a huge difference. And then others tutored. Some became friends with teachers and became classroom assistants. And then you won't be surprised, what do we have parked in our church parking lots throughout the week? Vans, right? Maybe we take the Scholar Roll students on an enrichment trip to the museum. They're doing well. They can take a morning off and go out and have another experience. So it moved into enrichment activities. And then, as Hazel pointed out, summer's a big time, and someone said, there are all sorts of camps around here. Why can't our kids go to camp? And so we made contact with existing camps. We didn't create a camp, and asked them if they would give scholarships to these young people to go to summer camps. So what happened, part of the, if you think of the brain development of these young people and what they've seen for much of their life, the trauma they've experienced, now they're beginning to see something different and say, what's that? Is that a choice that I have? Unfortunately, as Sophia has pointed out, the hopelessness is pretty severe, and it looks more like a TV show to many of the kids than a real possibility. But the more so that's the nature of the involvement, how it's grown, things that we've done. Others put on book fairs. I should say that now in Richmond, there are 125 faith communities in 23 elementary schools with 2,000 volunteers every year. Wow. And it's grown that big. So the experiences go well beyond what my church does and with Woodville Elementary School. But everyone's got to follow the lead of the principal. If the principal's not in, and you need a social worker, that's one of the things we found. Principal's got to be on board. You have to have a social worker that really can help connect the volunteers with the right needs within the facility and make certain that the volunteer skills match the needs. It can't be a haphazard volunteer effort to be really effective. But it's taken 15 years to get there, and now we're in our third principal, and we have to do it all over again with every new principal. You have to reform the trust and find out what's needed at that time for those students. I hope that's helpful.
Sally,
let me just mention that one of the things that's grown out of this understanding of relationships is we now believe, getting to the structural problems in the system, that the students do not have enough time with caring adults. And that could mean smaller class sizes, which is more expensive, longer school days, that's more expensive, summer programs, that's more expensive, more coaches, more social workers, more psychologists. But it's all about plugging into the kids and having relationships with them. So this now group of 125 faith communities is involved in advocating for greater school funding to increase the number of adults that are in the classroom and in the school interacting with kids. So it's now moved into the, we've 15 years, it gets frustrating when you don't see a change in the system. And so it's elevated a bit now.
Great. Thank you so much, Don. Sophia.
Yeah, I just wanted to underscore one really important point I think Don made, and I think it connects to something Hazel said too, but is the consistency if you're going to have a one-on-one relationship with a kid. So Hazel said earlier, like, it takes a village, and I think it's really true, and I think oftentimes we sort of prioritize which jobs in the village may be better, but we need the whole village. So when we partner with Trinity Church, there are volunteers who do tutoring and one-on-one relationships, but there are also volunteers who can't necessarily commit an hour or 2 hours a week every week consistently for at least a year, and so they help collect clothes. We have a group of volunteers who's thinking about how to start a food bank at our school so that we can help families get fresh food and produce, but also so we can bring families into the school and get them resources they need while also connecting them to teachers. And all of those things are really important and really valuable. We had 300 coats that were donated to our school this year and went almost immediately because the need was so much. So that's not a one-on-one relationship with a kid, but you better believe those kids and those families were grateful for that type of support. So I think there's a lot of different things that you need, that you can do, and or that different people can do based on what they're able to sort of commit to at that time. But it's really important to me to say that if you're going to do the one-on-one work with a kid, you have to really look forward in your own life and make sure that you can make that commitment. Because part of what happens is that kids internalize when you leave, and even if it's not about them, they're kids who've had a lot of people leave, and they believe it's about them, and it's just one more thing that ends up hurting them. So we really need to make sure that we think ahead and sort of commit to at least a year of working with one kid if that's what we're going to do.
So thank you for adding that, Sophia. We only have a couple minutes left, but I want to stay with you, and I want to ask you, from your perspective as a social worker embedded in a middle school and seeing volunteers, many of whom may have 1 or 0 ACEs in their own background experience, what would you say people really, really need to understand about how trauma affects a child's engagement with the world, whether we're talking about the trauma of poverty or some other trauma? Are there a couple of like high-level headline lessons for those of us who've been more protected?
Yeah, I think oh God, as soon as I hang up, I'm going to think of a bunch more. But I think
that's okay. We're just having a conversation, and I know I'm calling on you cold.
Is most important. I think one is this idea of fight, flight, or freeze. And I'm not going to go into what that is because I think that there's some of the references that the panelists have given for today that you can read. I think some of you guys have already read some, and there's a ton online. But I think it's really important to know that that part of our brain that does fight, flight, or freeze, which is the sort of survival part, is really a part of our brain. It's not a choice. And also, it's an important part of our brain because it keeps us safe. But with kids with trauma, it's being used in an inappropriate setting. So that fight, flight, or freeze is really helpful when a car runs a stoplight and I'm crossing the street when I'm supposed to be and have to realize that my life is in danger. It's really not helpful if that part of your brain kicks in when a door slams in an English classroom and I have the same reaction. And so I think kids are often seen as anywhere from extremely violent to extremely disrespectful to extremely dramatic or emotional. And it's important to me that we realize that that's because that's actually what they're experiencing. They're not excessively violent. They are violent considering what their bodies are going through, and it's a process for them to learn sort of when they're safe and when they're not safe. And I hope that's not too confusing. People can ask me later. But it's a big thing with me that kids will do good if they can. And so if they're not, it's generally because they don't yet have the skills to know how to do good in the context of school. The second thing for me, and I'll be really quick, sorry, is that we don't need to know kids' trauma to be empathetic, to be compassionate, or to be supportive. We don't need kids to tell us all the horrible things that have happened to them in their lives. We just need to believe that if they could do good, they would, and that their behavior is trying to communicate some need to us, even if we as the adults don't even know what it is. So if a kid is really refusing to read and being rude about it and saying, like, I'm not going to do this, you know, walking away from you, maybe saying inappropriate language, they're probably communicating to you that some part of reading is really, really hard for them, and it's stressing them out. And so looking for the message behind the behavior, thinking about why they're doing the behavior that they're doing is really important. And probably with some of the young people, it's because of trauma. But we don't actually need to know all those stories. And those stories will be told to us when kids feel safe telling them to us. So we got to let kids share their lives with us in their own time. Sorry if that
Thank
was
you. No,
Excellent.
that was perfect. That was perfect, Sophia. Thank you so much. And I think those are two really incredibly valuable and heart-centered, experience-based headlines for all of us. So I thank you for those. At this time, I want to turn it over to Mary Liz and see, Mary Liz, whether you have questions from our participants who've been listening in on this conversation.
So I don't currently have any questions, so if anybody has any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box. But I do have a question for Hazel that backtracks a little bit into the conversation, which is, but it touches on something Dawn talked about a lot, which is how to maneuver the relationships with the leaders of the educational institution you want to go into. And I know that part of your job is educating people who will become educators and future educational leaders. So I'm wondering if you have any insight or tips for people who want to start forging those relationships with principals, guidance counselors, maybe even superintendents who want to approach them about volunteering in the schools, and what are some ways that they can do that, and how to equip themselves for that work.
So I teach a course called Building School Community, and it's the very first course that students take when they enter the Education Leadership Program. And basically what I do is I tell students the role of a principal is, yes, the main responsibility is instructional programs, the curriculum. The main responsibility is also how do you work with teachers, etc. But one of the critical parts of your job is how do you build community within the school and how you utilize all the resources outside of the community. And that for many principals is very difficult. They're dealing with mandated testing, they're dealing with students with all different needs, and now you're asking them to work with an outside agency. And for many principals, and for many people, building a partnership is sort of difficult. And so we go through this list of things of what is not a partnership. And a partnership is not an agency coming into your school and providing a service that is duplicate, that you already have. So we go through this process where we look at this data. And data is so important, not just for the school, but also for any agency that's going to work with schools. Look at the data. Does the data tell you that students, they need more help in math, they need more help in the rigorous courses so that they could do well on getting into college? Does the data show you that you have high absenteeism rates, which always lead to low academic performance? I mean, there's this direct connection. So become very familiar with the data, and then look to see what services are already provided in the school and where the gaps are. So the community, all of the different groups outside could certainly come into schools to sort of help the schools fill the gap. And I say help the schools fill the gap because it is a partnership. When I worked out in Queens and in the pipeline programs, we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to create partnerships, how to create teams, obviously looking at the data, looking at the needs, and then trying to identify who in the community would help you sort of fulfill that need. If you have too much tutoring in your school and your students don't need it, perhaps you need another type of a partner to work with. The other thing I tell my students is how to utilize grant funds to do different, unique, innovative things that could build community. A principal has a budget that is more or less mandated services, but the principal can use private or any type of grant-funded sources to create different programs that are needed to fill those gaps. One of the other things we talk a lot about is sustaining good practices. I think, Don, you talked about you do something in a school, and then when the principal leaves, there goes the good activity. So how do you sustain good practices? And it all goes back to how do you develop a structure in a school that would facilitate collaboration. Facilitate collaboration with guidance counselors, social workers. One of the things I'm always surprised about with my students is how they do not utilize existing services in the school. And I always tell them your guidance counselor and your social worker, those are your two best friends. And you cannot ignore the important role that those two professionals play. In large schools where you have one guidance counselor to 200-300 students, it's very difficult for them to do guidance. And similarly with social workers. So a good use of funds, extra funds, is to hire support staff. If students, if they're not dealing with the affective, the emotional and social needs, there's absolutely no way you can get to the academic. So the advice I would give them is that's where you start really. You just don't go straight into the academics and try to build a fantastic program and then students are not learning because there's something that's going on. Your social worker and your guidance counselor, you got to work very closely with them. So those are some of the things that we talk about.
Great, thank you.
For people in bigger districts, I think Hazel, you touched on something. So we have a school of 410 students. We have one part-time school psychologist who's there 2 days a week, one guidance counselor, and potentially we're losing the guidance counselor next year because of budget cuts. So I think you're totally right. The schools need partners, in so many different ways because, at least in Boston Public Schools, there's really a shortage.
Just one thing, Don. I had the opportunity of doing some work with a public school. It's called Middle College High School. It's a public school on a college campus. And they selected, or students came to the school to identified by the guidance counselors potential dropouts. So these are at-risk students. And one of the things that they did was to spend a lot of emphasis on advising and not just hiring social workers and guidance counselors, but really looking at teachers serving as mentors. So all adults in the building sort of took the responsibility for working with students. We know that both schools will always have a shortage of guidance staff and social workers, but you have enough adults in the building who, if you work in tandem with the guidance counselor, could do a bit of training of teachers to do things like waking a child up to come to school, talking to them, a lot of things that a guidance counselor could do. Teachers already do anyhow, so to formalize that relationship, a teacher as a mentor is so important. And obviously, outside agencies like churches could certainly come in and provide additional support. But all adults, and that's a key part of student engagement is connecting that child with an adult, a caring adult.
Thank you so much. Don, were you trying to get in? To you, Don.
Well, I wanted to add a thought. The experience I have is similar to what Sophia describes, that honestly, our schools don't have the staff to manage the volunteers. And what we've done is there's a not-for-profit in Richmond. It's got branches around the country. It's called Communities in Schools, which is basically staffed with social workers. And our church pays half of the person's salary to get them into our school. And it's the only way we can connect our volunteers in a way that makes sense to the school. This person is like Sophia, in the school, knows what the school needs and knows the students by name, and can do the matches. But it requires effort to get that village into the school to do its job. It won't just happen without the school having the resources. So absent the school system funding it, we look to our not-for-profit community in Richmond to fund that one resource in each of the elementary schools.
Well, thank you all. Thank you all very much. We've come to the end of the time of our open discussion, and we want to ask our participants who've been listening in to help us reflect and learn how we can do this better. So if you would use the chat function that Mary Liz described at the opening of our call to give us some feedback. We'd like to know what worked well for you, and use a very broad scope, thinking about the content of what we've been talking about, thinking about the format that we've used, the technology. We like hearing about what worked well, and we also want to hear from you about what we could have done to make this more helpful to you, more engaging. So type away and let us hear from you. And as you're doing so, I'm going to just let everybody know that you'll be getting a follow-up email from us with a link to this recording that you can share. These webinars are open and they're free, and anybody who has the link can participate. Our next one is Tuesday, March 28th. Again, from 7 to 8:15. We're going back to Tuesday night. We decided not to compete with pancake suppers across the Episcopal Church, which are happening widely tomorrow night, so that's why we're meeting tonight on a Monday night. But next month in March, we'll be back on a Tuesday. And our topic is funding a partnership, what you need to know, what you don't, and how to get started. So when that email comes to you, you'll also be added to our monthly email list, and you'll also be hearing from Province 1 about next month's call. When that comes to you, if that's a topic that you think would be of interest to others in your congregation or in your community or in your partnership, please let them know, and they can sign up just by clicking on that link. We're not seeing much feedback, so we need your help learning how to get better. So we'd love to hear from you. Also in March, we're shifting to a new technology platform. We're not going to be using Adobe Connect. We'll be using a different one. So we might need to build in a little bit of extra time to help us all learn this new platform. But you can learn about that through the link. Finally, I want to read a prayer, and then we'll close.
So we do have one question before we close.
Yes, Mary Liz.
About communities and schools. And I actually think I can answer this question. It's from Heidi Weber. Communities and Schools is a national nonprofit. It is secular. It is not affiliated with the Episcopal Church or any other church, and they serve schools all over the country. And they work happily with churches and congregations of any faith tradition, and they also work with other secular nonprofits and school districts.
Thanks, Mary Liz. Thanks for your question, Heidi. This is a prayer that we attribute to Teresa of Avila. Christ has no body now on earth but yours, no hands but yours, no feet but yours. Yours are the eyes through which Christ's compassion is to look out to the world. Yours are the feet with which Christ is to go about doing good. Yours are the hands with which Christ is to bless all people now. I want to thank each of you for the work that you're doing in your communities. The work you're doing makes a difference in the lives of children, of communities, families, and congregations. God bless you and goodbye. And panelists, if you'd stay with us for a few moments, please.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.